The conference room on the 14th floor of Hartfield and Associates smelled like new carpet and old money. I'd been sitting in the same chair for 22 minutes, watching my daughter-in-law's attorney arrange his papers with the kind of deliberate slowness that only men billing $400 an hour can afford. I was wearing a gray suit I'd bought at a thrift store in Roanoke for $11. One of the buttons on the sleeve was slightly off color, replaced after the original one cracked. My shoes were clean but scuffed at the toes. My daughter-in-law had looked me up and down when I walked in, and then leaned toward my son and whispered something that made him look away. The attorney's name was Philip Carver. Mid-40s. Silver cufflinks. The kind of haircut that costs more than most people's car payments. He cleared his throat and addressed the arbitrator, a composed woman named Sandra Okafor, who sat at the head of the long mahogany table with a legal pad and the patient expression of someone who had seen every variation of human greed. "Miss Okafor," Carver began, "we appreciate the opportunity to resolve this matter without further litigation. My clients have been more than reasonable." He gestured toward my son and my daughter-in-law, who sat across from me in matching navy blazers like they'd coordinated outfits for picture day. Mr. Reeves transferred the assets voluntarily. The investment agreement was signed, witnessed, and notarized. The subsequent business losses were market conditions, not misconduct. He paused, letting that settle, then looked at me the way people look at a stain on a couch they're about to reupholster. Mr. Reeves is 63 years old. He's been living in a studio apartment in Lynchburg since the property transfer. He has no legal representation today because, frankly, no attorney he could afford would take this case on contingency with the evidence as it stands. My daughter-in-law pressed her lips together to hide a smile. My son stared at the table. Carver continued, "We're not unsympathetic, but the facts are the facts. Mr. Reeves made a voluntary financial decision. That decision didn't pan out. Asking the court to reverse it because he's unhappy with the outcome isn't a legal remedy. It's wishful thinking." Sandra Okafor made a note on her pad. She looked up at me over her reading glasses. "Mr. Reeves, you've chosen to represent yourself today. Before we proceed, I need to confirm your information for the record. Please state your full legal name and your former occupation." I folded my hands on the table. This was the moment I had been building toward for 2 years, 1 month, and 11 days. "Thomas William Reeves," I said. "Retired Special Agent, IRS Criminal Investigation Division, 28 years of service." The room went quiet in a way that felt physical, like the air pressure had changed. Philip Carver's pen stopped moving. Sandra Okafor looked up from her pad very slowly. She set her pen down. She looked at me with an expression that told me she understood exactly what those words meant, what they implied, what they had already set in motion. My daughter-in-law's smile had not so much disappeared as frozen in place, a smile that no longer knew it was a smile. "Could you repeat your former title?" Sandra Okafor asked, her voice measured and careful. "Special Agent, IRS Criminal Investigation. I retired with the rank of Senior Team Coordinator, Complex Financial Fraud Unit, Roanoke Field Office." My son made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. The conference room door opened. 2 people entered. A man and a woman, both in dark jackets. Both moving with the unhurried confidence of people who have done this many times. The man held a document in one hand. The woman made brief eye contact with Sandra Okafor and gave a small, professional nod. My daughter-in-law pushed her chair back from the table. "Amanda Christine Reeves?" The woman spoke first. My daughter-in-law's full legal name in a room that suddenly felt very small. Yes. What is this?" My daughter-in-law looked at Carver. "Philip, what is happening?" "Mrs. Reeves, I'm Special Agent Dana Peel, IRS Criminal Investigation, in coordination with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of Virginia. This is my colleague, Special Agent Marcus Webb." She held up a document. "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, fraudulent transfer of assets, and tax evasion totaling approximately $1.4 million. Philip Carver was on his feet. This is completely improper. We are in the middle of a binding arbitration proceeding, and you cannot. Counselor. Marcus Webb's voice was quiet but final. The warrant was signed this morning by a federal magistrate judge. The arbitration can continue after your client is processed. You're welcome to meet her at the federal building. He looked at my daughter-in-law, Mrs. Reeves. Please stand up. She did not scream. I want to be clear about that, because I had half expected it. Instead, she made a sound like the air going out of something, a long, trembling exhale, and then she stood up very slowly and put her wrists together in front of her, and I looked at my son across the table. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at me. Let me tell you who I am. Who I actually am. I spent 28 years with IRS criminal investigation, which most people don't know exists until they find themselves on the wrong end of it. We're not the people who send letters about audits. We're the people who show up when someone has turned tax evasion into a lifestyle, when someone has built a criminal enterprise and needs clean money to come out the other side. We build cases that put people away. We follow money through shell companies and offshore accounts and fake invoices and nominee accounts across a dozen jurisdictions. We are patient. We are methodical. We do not move until the case is airtight. I retired at 61 after a mild cardiac event that my doctor called a warning and that I called an inconvenience. My wife, Eleanor, had passed 2 years earlier from pancreatic cancer. The house in Roanoke felt too big without her, too full of quiet. Our son, had moved to Richmond with his wife 5 years before. We'd never been as close as I wanted us to be, but after Eleanor died, we started talking more. He called on Sundays. We had dinner when I drove down. His wife had always made me slightly uneasy, in the way that a number that almost adds up makes you uneasy. She was charming, quick with a laugh, very attentive to my son in public. But there were moments, small ones, easy to dismiss when I caught her looking at things with a kind of calculating attention that reminded me of people I had spent my career investigating. I dismissed it. She was my daughter-in-law. She loved my son. I was a retired man with too much time and an occupational habit of suspicion. The investment proposal came 8 months after my retirement. They drove up to Roanoke on a Saturday in October with a presentation printed and bound, which should have told me something right there. My son explained it. They were expanding their restaurant, Copper Table, from 1 location in Richmond to 3. They had a site in Charlottesville, another in Fredericksburg. They needed capital. They'd been turned down by 2 banks because the business was too new, less than 2 years old. Family investment, my son said, was the only path forward. My daughter-in-law did most of the talking. She had numbers, projected revenue, lease costs, staffing budgets, expected return on investment within 4 years. She was organized and persuasive, and she looked at me the whole time she spoke, not at my son, which I noticed but didn't examine. I signed over $340,000. My entire liquid savings outside of my pension and Social Security. And because they needed collateral for one of the commercial leases, I co-signed a document that, I was told, was a temporary lien on the Roanoke property. A formality. 6 months later, the Roanoke property had been transferred to a holding company called Meridian Hospitality Group LLC, registered in Delaware, and I was being told that the restaurants were struggling, that the market was tougher than expected, and that the Charlottesville and Fredericksburg locations had never actually opened because the leases had fallen through. I asked to see the financial records. My daughter-in-law said they were with the accountant. I asked for the accountant's name. There was a pause, half a second, maybe less, that told me everything. I did not let her see that I noticed. Here is what 28 years of financial investigation teaches you. The first instinct, when you discover you have been robbed, is to react, to confront, to demand, to threaten. That instinct is almost always wrong. Reaction tips off the target. Reaction causes evidence to disappear. Reaction turns a case you could win into one you cannot prove. I went home to my studio apartment. I had moved out of the Roanoke house as the transfer was being processed, Told I needed to give the management company time to prepare the property, and I made coffee and I sat at the kitchen table and I thought for 4 hours. Then I called the one person I trusted without qualification. Frank Brennan had been my supervisor for 11 of my 28 years. He was 67 now, fully retired, living outside Charlottesville with his wife and 2 dogs and a garden he claimed was therapeutic and that his wife claimed was an obsession. He was the most careful investigator I had ever known and the most honest man I had ever worked alongside. We met at a diner off Route 29 that neither of us had been to before. "Walk me through it," he said. I did. From the investment proposal to the property transfer to the conversation about financial records. I laid it out the way I had been trained to lay out a case facts in order, no editorializing, nothing I couldn't document. Frank listened without interrupting. When I finished, he looked at his coffee for a long moment. "How much do you have documented right now?" "The investment agreement, the property transfer, the LLC registration, that's what I can put my hands on directly. And you want to go after it yourself?" "I want to build the case properly. If I go to my old contacts now, with what I have, it's a civil matter. A transfer dispute between family members. Lawyers get involved, money moves, evidence disappears, and my son ends up testifying that I agreed to everything and have become confused in my retirement." Frank looked at me. "You think they'd do that? Your own son?" I thought about my son's face when he wouldn't meet my eyes after the property conversation. Not guilt, exactly. Something more complicated. A man who had told himself a story about what he was doing and needed the story to hold. "I think my daughter-in-law would do it," I said, "and I think my son would let her." Frank was quiet for a moment. "So what do you need from me?" "I need access to someone at the U.S. Attorney's office who can be trusted to hold this until the case is ready, not to open an investigation yet. Just to have a name, a contact, someone who will act when I bring them something that cannot be ignored." "And until then?" "Until then," I said, "I'm just a confused old man who got taken advantage of and doesn't quite understand what happened." Frank shook his head slowly. He looked out the window at the parking lot. Then he looked back at me. "You know this could take years." "I know. You'll be watching your son live in your house. Your daughter-in-law spending your money. I know that too. Thomas." He leaned forward. "You're 62 years old. You had a cardiac event 14 months ago. This is not nothing." "Frank." I looked at him steadily. "My wife worked for 30 years. That house was paid for with her teaching salary as much as mine. She wanted our grandchildren to grow up in it someday. I am not going to let it be stripped and laundered without doing everything I know how to do to stop it." He studied me for what felt like a long time. Then he nodded. "Give me a week," he said. "I'll find you the right contact." What I built over the next 2 years, I built slowly and carefully in the same studio apartment they had expected to humble me. I had a laptop and an encrypted external drive and the methodical patience of someone who had spent nearly 3 decades following money through mazes designed by people who thought they were smarter than everyone else. Meridian Hospitality Group was not a restaurant holding company. It was the topmost visible layer of something considerably larger. My daughter-in-law had not invented this. She had been recruited into it, I came to believe, by a man named Douglas Fitch, who ran a commercial real estate and hospitality company out of Richmond with about 60 employees and a client list that included 3 regional restaurant chains, 2 property developers, and a handful of small manufacturing businesses. The common thread was money that came in through legitimate-looking transactions and emerged clean on the other side. Fake consulting invoices. Inflated management fees paid to shell entities. Depreciation schemes on properties that had been deliberately overvalued at acquisition. It was not exotic. It was the kind of thing I had seen in some form or another for most of my career. The arrogance was always the same, the belief that complexity equaled safety, that if you layered enough legitimate-looking entities between the crime and the money, no one patient enough to unwind it all would ever come looking. My daughter-in-law's role was property acquisition and transfer. She found assets, retirement, savings from trusting relatives, home equity from elderly investors, Inheritance funds brought them into the structure through investment agreements that looked legal and transferred them into entities where they disappeared into the machine. She was good at it. She had a genuine gift for making people feel that they were being taken care of. My son, I concluded after many months of difficult, honest thinking, knew that something was not right. He did not know the full scope. But he was not innocent. He had signed documents he hadn't read. He had cashed checks he hadn't questioned. He had looked away from things that should have made him look harder, and he had done it because the life they were living was comfortable. And comfort is a powerful argument. That was the hardest part, not the investigation itself. Not the long nights, with financial records and corporate filings and banking documents that Frank quietly helped me access through channels I will not detail here. The hardest part was arriving, methodically and without any room for self-deception, at an accurate picture of my son. I had driven up to Richmond 4 times over those 2 years. My son and daughter-in-law didn't know I came. I sat in my car outside the Copper Table, the original location that was actually operating, and I watched them through the window. They looked happy. My daughter-in-law laughed at something, touched my son's arm. My son said something to a server that made the young man smile. They looked like people who had built a life and were enjoying it. They were also laundering money through a restaurant that used my retirement savings as the initial seed capital for a criminal enterprise. By the spring of last year, I had what I needed. 14 months of transaction records, 7 shell company structures documented, 3 banks involved, and a provable trail connecting my $340,000 through 3 layers of entities to Douglas Fitch's primary operating account. I had my daughter-in-law's signature on 11 documents that would be very difficult to explain under oath. I brought it to Frank's contact at the U.S. Attorney's office, a prosecutor named Catherine Marsh, who had 12 years of financial crime cases behind her, and the specific, contained excitement of someone looking at something solid. "This is good," she said, turning pages. "This is very good. There's more. I haven't given you the property records yet." She looked up. "How long did you spend on this?" 2 years, roughly. She looked at me for a moment. "You did all of this yourself? Out of retirement?" I had good training. She almost smiled. "When do you want us to move?" I explained about the arbitration. My daughter-in-law had filed it herself, 2 months earlier, to have the asset transfers formally and legally confirmed, a process that would make them nearly impossible to claw back and would establish, in the public record, that I had agreed to everything voluntarily. She had wanted it resolved before the statute of limitations on certain elements of the transfer became a consideration. She had not known, of course, that I had been the one to allow the arbitration to proceed. That I had declined, very quietly, through Frank, to accept several legal aid offers. That I had specifically requested Sandra Okafor as arbitrator because Sandra Okafor had a federal judicial clerkship in her background and would know exactly what it meant when I said what I was going to say. "I want them served in the room," I told Catherine Marsh, my daughter-in-law at the table. After I've stated my background for the record, she tapped her pen on the folder. "That's not standard procedure." "No," I said. But she spent 2 years treating me like a confused old man who didn't understand what had happened to him. I'd like the last thing she sees, before the handcuffs, to be that she was wrong about that. Catherine Marsh looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Tuesday the 14th, she said. 10 o'clock. "I'll be there. Mr. Reeves." She paused. "Wear whatever you want." I wore the $11 thrift store suit. In the conference room, after my daughter-in-law was processed and Philip Carver had gathered his things with the shell-shocked efficiency of a man already calculating his exposure, Sandra Okafor set down her pen and looked at me across the table. "Former Special Agent Reeves," she said. "In 14 years of arbitration work, I've never had a proceeding end quite this way. I apologize for the disruption to your schedule." "Don't." She gathered her legal pad. "Your daughter-in-law's attorney spent 40 minutes telling me you were a financially unsophisticated elderly man who had made a poorly considered investment decision." She paused. "Meanwhile, you've apparently spent 2 years building a federal fraud case from a studio apartment." "I had a lot of time," I said. She almost laughed. The asset freeze will cover the Roanoke property. The U.S. Attorney's Office will be in contact about the civil recovery process. It won't be fast, but based on what Agent Peel indicated before they left, the case is solid. She stood up. Get a real attorney now. You've earned the right to one. I drove to Richmond that afternoon. I called my son from the parking lot outside his apartment building and told him I was downstairs. He came out in jeans and a sweatshirt, and he looked 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him. He knew. Agent Webb had called him after the arrest to inform him that he was a person of interest in the investigation and should retain counsel immediately. We sat on a bench outside the building. Neither of us spoke for a while. I didn't know the whole thing, he finally said. I know you didn't, but I knew something wasn't right. He said it like a confession. She kept saying it was complicated, that the accounting was complicated, that I shouldn't worry about it. I know. Dad. He looked at me. His eyes were red. You knew what she was doing for 2 years and you didn't say anything. I needed to build the case correctly. If I had confronted you, it would have tipped off Douglas Fitch, and everything would have disappeared. Your mother's house would have been gone permanently. He looked down at his hands. Mom's house, he said, quietly. That's the one I was not willing to let go. We sat there in the September afternoon, and I watched a kid on a bicycle go past, and I thought about Eleanor the way she had talked about that house, about the yard where she had planned to have a garden someday. The room, she had said, would be a good guest room when grandchildren eventually needed somewhere to stay. I had spent 2 years in a studio apartment for that house. For her, for the version of the future she had wanted and that I intended to give back to myself and to him. I'm going to cooperate, my son said. With the investigation. Whatever they need. That's the right decision. Am I going to prison? I had thought about this question for a long time. If you cooperate fully and completely, and you tell them everything you know about Fitch's operation, the prosecutor will probably offer you a deferred prosecution agreement. You'll pay restitution. You'll have conditions. But you're not going to federal prison if you do this right. He nodded slowly. He looked so much like a younger version of himself, sitting there. The boy who used to bring me coffee when I worked late, who had his mother's nose and my stubbornness and a fundamental decency underneath everything that I had spent 2 years afraid his wife had permanently erased. I'm sorry, Dad, he said. I'm really sorry. I know you are. I stood up. Get a good attorney. Not Carver. Someone who specializes in cooperative federal matters. And call me after you've spoken to them. He stood up too. He looked like he wanted to say something else, and then he did something I hadn't expected. He hugged me, just grabbed me, the way he used to when he was 10 years old and had fallen off his bike, holding on like the ground had proven unreliable. I held on too. I'm not going anywhere, I said. That's not who I am. The house in Roanoke came back to me 14 months later, after the asset recovery process ground through its stages. My daughter-in-law pleaded guilty to 3 of the 7 counts and received 6 years. Douglas Fitch went to trial and lost, comprehensively, and was sentenced to 11 years. 14 other people in the network received various charges and plea agreements. My son's deferred prosecution agreement was finalized 9 months after the arrest. He paid restitution from the sale of their Richmond condo. He moved back to Roanoke, into a rental 3 miles from me, and we have dinner on Sundays now. It's not simple between us. I don't think it will be for a long time. But we're working at it, and working at something honestly is always better than pretending it's already fixed. Frank came to see the house when I moved back in. We sat on the back porch, and he looked at the yard, which had gone wild in 2 years of vacancy, and he said, Eleanor would be furious about those hedges. Eleanor would have pruned them herself at 6 in the morning and not told anyone, I said. He laughed. We drank our coffee and let the afternoon go long and quiet. I think about what I looked like, walking into that conference room, 63 years old, $11 suit, scuffed shoes, no lawyer at my side. I know what Philip Carver saw. A diminished man. A cautionary tale about retirement decisions made badly. Someone without resources, without options, without the ability to meaningfully push back against 2 attorneys and a stack of notarized documents. I want you to understand something about that. I was not pretending to be weak. I was not performing humility. I chose to walk in there exactly as I was, because who I am, what I know, what I built over 28 years, what I learned from watching how money moves and how lies travel that had nothing to do with the cost of my jacket. They looked at my clothes and thought they saw the whole picture. They didn't see the encrypted drives. They didn't see the 2 years of work. They didn't see that the arbitration itself had been a trap I had allowed to close around them. People will do that. They will look at your age, your address, your salary, the label on your shirt, and they will make a decision about your power in the room. They will adjust their voices. They will stop being careful. They will show you exactly who they are, because they are certain you cannot do anything about it. Let them. Let them underestimate the gray in your hair. Let them dismiss the worn-out shoes. Let them assume that a man who lives in a studio apartment and drives a 10-year-old car must not know anything worth knowing. The truth doesn't care about appearances. The truth just needs someone patient enough to carry it until the right moment. I carried mine for 2 years, 1 month, and 11 days. And when I finally set it down, in a 14th floor conference room that smelled like new carpet and old money, it was everything I needed it to be. If someone has ever looked at you and decided, before you even opened your mouth, that you were not worth taking seriously, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you know someone who has been dismissed, pushed aside, written off because of what they look like or what they have or what they used to have, share this with them. Because sometimes the person who looks like they've already lost is the one who has been quietly, patiently, methodically winning the whole time.